Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fernando, and I'm an advanced pharmacist in urgent care with a specialist interest in anticoagulation here at Northampton General Hospital. I wanted to start out by saying a massive thank you to everybody at Thrombosis UK for organising such a fantastic conference, and to each and every one of you delegates for tuning in to learn a little bit more about the amazing work being undertaken within the realm of thrombosis within the UK. So today I'm delighted to be able to share with you just a small fraction of the work being done at Northampton General by the dedicated ward pharmacy team. Now I've got my poster open here. I'm hoping that you can all see that on the screen. But before we get into the kind of parameters of this poster and all the data that I've got to share with you today, I just wanted to give a little bit of background for those delegates who don't necessarily work within the pharmacy field, who might not understand what we mean by dedicated ward pharmacists, just so that we're really clear going forward why these posts have enabled this piece of work to happen. So historically, within a hospital setting, you would find that maybe a single pharmacist might be expected to cover quite a few wards, multiple wards, including maybe time in the dispensary, validating prescriptions, dispensing, or perhaps even checking items. And this has been the case for quite a long period of time. And one of the flaws that we find with this method of working is that it really limits the clinical capacity of these pharmacists to only essential roles. So this may mean that pharmacists only have that capacity to do very clinically urgent jobs. So that might be validating discharge prescriptions, or ordering urgent inpatient orders, or completing medicines reconciliation for patients. But we know that pharmacists have clinical skills way beyond this, and there's a lot of advanced roles that pharmacists can fill which directly benefit patient care. So I think it was in 2016, there was a pilot at Blackburn Hospital where pharmacists were allocated only one ward regularly all day with no other commitments, and they also had increased support from technical pharmacy staff. And they did a lot of data collection on direct patient outcomes, and the results of these were absolutely phenomenal. So we saw a reduced length of stay for these patients, safer medicines use, reduced drug expenditure, just to name a few. And so obviously after this amazing result that we saw, a number of other trusts have also successfully implemented this dedicated ward pharmacist model with an ever expanding and enhancing role for these professionals. So here at Northampton, we began this dedicated pharmacist role on our two very large admission wards in 2021. And obviously with these posts being funded by the trust, we wanted to prove that the roles were advantageous. So we wanted to show that we were making a difference with this additional funding we have been given. So we thought of a number of key performance indicators, one of which was patient safety. And this is where VTE comes in. So at the moment, Northampton are in the process of applying for VTE exemplar centre status. And one of the areas that is quite heavily looked at is compliance to the NHS England target for completing VTE risk assessments for adult inpatients. Now we know that the NICE thromboprophylaxis guideline recommends that all patients over the age of 16 should have a VTE risk assessment completed as soon as possible on admission. And this should then prompt prescribing thromboprophylaxis. So that's whether it's mechanical or pharmacological, both together or indeed none. And the target that is specified in NHS England's standard contract is that 95% of all inpatients should have a completed VTE risk assessment. So at least 95%. Now we have some provisional data historically from the trust that has been collected by the VTE team, and that showed quite consistently that here at Northampton General we weren't meeting this target, and this is probably for quite a few reasons, but one of the major ones in my opinion is that we still use paper drug charts. So here within the trust, as you can see on my poster here, this white box is our VTE risk assessment, which is located within the paper drug chart. So at the moment, we are waiting for the imminent implementation of electronic prescribing, but until that comes into place, admitting clinicians are not necessarily electronically prompted to complete a VTE risk assessment. And so often this step in the admissions process is missed. So here's where these dedicated ward pharmacists can step in. So as part of the benefits realisation reports we were putting together, we decided to see what a difference it could make if we had pharmacists completing these VTE risk assessments within the paper drug chart as part of their normal inpatient review. So we wanted to see what difference that would make. And in order to do that, I composed an audit just to see where we were at baseline. So for 1 week in January in 2022, I did this audit from Monday through to Friday on both of the admission wards at around lunchtime every day. And I included all patients that had newly been admitted to both of the admissions wards. I looked at data as to whether they'd had a decision to admit, when that was, when the VTE risk assessment had been done, if it had been done at all, and whether any prescribed thromboprophylaxis was correct based on their patient characteristics. So for example, their age or their weight. I also determined if any missing thromboprophylaxis was appropriate. So have they had a bleed and that's why they're not prescribed pharmacological thromboprophylaxis, for example. So in that first week, I saw 173 patients. And if I scroll down on my poster here, this is that first week. So this first half of the line graph is the first week data. So only 75% overall had a VTE risk assessment completed. Now this orange line here is our target. That's our 95% that we're trying to meet. And you can see that on every day, we didn't meet that at all. And overall, this is 75%. So we're not meeting our 95% target. And looking at my assessments as well, based clinically on whether they had had correct thromboprophylaxis for their patient characteristics or whether thromboprophylaxis was missing when it should be prescribed. We can see here on these pie charts, which is next to it, this blue box here, almost 27%, so over a quarter of our patient cohort had either incorrect or missing thromboprophylaxis. So that obviously leads to quite a big risk of patient harm through either hospital-acquired thrombosis or indeed perhaps increased bleeding risk if they're on an anticoagulant dose which is perhaps too high for their patient characteristics. So with this baseline data in hand, the dedicated ward pharmacy team decided that pharmacists intervening by completing any outstanding VTE risk assessments could have quite a big impact on these figures. So the aim of this was not to remove the focus from our doctor colleagues completing this as a step in the admissions pathway, but rather to contribute by ensuring that those that had not been completed for whatever reason were done in a timely way. So we're not trying to take away workload from one speciality to the other, it's just to contribute as a team approach. So in order to facilitate this, I decided to do some training for our dedicated ward pharmacists. So at that time, there were 6 within urgent care. And we did some training on how to complete a VTE risk assessment. And I did this using face-to-face training tools. So we did a presentation. We looked at very specific examples and worked through them together. And I also put together a crib sheet of all the points that you would normally see here in this risk assessment, what they meant, how you would find that information, just so that they were armoured slightly better in order to move forward and complete these risk assessments. After they'd had this training, they were then advised to complete any missing VTE risk assessments at the point of their usual pharmacist inpatient review. So they're not actively seeking out missing risk assessments, but rather incorporating that process of checking and completing these assessments as part of their typical screening process. And just to note as well, we advised only the initial risk assessment on admission was completed. So those at 24 hours, or if there was any clinical change, that was still the responsibility of the medical or surgical team looking after that patient. But the on admission risk assessment was the ones that the pharmacists were contributing to. So we can see some results here then. In the first week of this intervention, I repeated exactly the same audit parameters. So Monday to Friday at about lunchtime, looking at all newly admitted patients to the admission wards. And you can see here on the line graph again, the second half now, that the target has been met quite a few times. Now, if you average out all of these data points, you get 95%. So on average, we could see that the number of completed risk assessments improved to 95%. And obviously that tiptoes over and under the line, but it's a much, much better picture than the previous week when we didn't have pharmacists intervening. I also actually looked at how many risk assessments were completed by pharmacists compared to our doctor colleagues. And over a quarter, so 26% of all of the completed risk assessments within that week were done by pharmacists. So that's, a huge figure towards improving this data set. And looking at the pie charts we have here, so again, we remember before that 27% of patients in our first week had incorrect thromboprophylaxis or missing thromboprophylaxis. That reduced quite significantly to 14%. So we've dramatically improved patient safety there. And it's just worth noting that the patients who did not have correct thromboprophylaxis or thromboprophylaxis prescribed when they should have, those were patients who had either just been brought up from the emergency department, so they hadn't yet been seen by a pharmacist, or the pharmacist was in the process of actively encouraging the doctors to change that dose. So it was being managed with. So a massive improvement in patient safety there. I think also following on from this, quite an interesting follow-up project really would be to look retrospectively now at the HAT analysis, so our hospital-acquired thrombosis root cause analysis, pre and post this intervention, to see whether this change had any effect on what happened after discharge. So are we seeing a reduction in how many hospital-acquired thrombosis we have? Or indeed, is there a shift in the contributory factors if there are any preventable hospital-acquired thrombosis? So that's a piece of work that we might consider following up after this audit now. So following from this quite intense data collection that we did for these few weeks, pharmacists have continued to complete VTE risk assessment. So it's now quite ingrained in our practice on admissions. And we've stepped down this audit tool just to a monthly point prevalence surveillance. So that's in keeping with the wider trust reporting tools. So we do that across every ward in the hospital, and that's what the VTE team were collecting before we started doing this piece of work. So it all feeds in quite nicely to that. And we also submitted this data to the trust board. So as part of that dedicated ward pharmacist benefit realisation report that I was talking about, we submitted this data, which was commended. And we also submitted to the Trust Thrombosis Committee as well, for note. And following on from that, it's been rolled out to all the other dedicated ward pharmacist areas in the trust as well. So we're having quite a big impact, not only within admissions, but within the wider trust as well, which is really fantastic to see. Now, obviously, any service improvement project has some limitations, and this is no exception. Trying to find paper drug charts, for any of you who work in a hospital with paper drug charts, can be quite difficult. So that was a slight hindrance, but should be made easier when we have electronic prescribing in place. We also don't have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week dedicated ward pharmacy service within urgent care. So this intervention is not completed on weekdays or bank holidays, which kind of creates a bit of a postcode lottery depending on what day of the week you arrive into hospital as to whether you might be seen by a pharmacist or not on those days. So in summary, if I scroll down here, in summary, we can see from this data that involving dedicated ward pharmacists in completing VTE risk assessments has had a massive improvement in patient safety across the admission wards at Northampton here. The success of this has been so substantial, like I mentioned, that we've rolled this out to the other dedicated ward pharmacists as well, so that it's more ingrained across the trust. And going forwards, I have already mentioned a couple of times that we're looking at introducing electronic prescribing. Hopefully that system will negate the need to continue this, because prescribers will be prompted to complete a VTE risk assessment before they're allowed to do any prescribing. But as an interim measure, I think this continues to be quite a successful way of keeping up with trying to match our 95% target. So if there are any other trusts struggling with compliance to NHS England's 95% target, who have paper drug charts and also have a dedicated ward pharmacist presence, I would really highly advise you consider trialling their involvement in the risk assessment process and see the benefits that might have within your own trust. And that is it for this presentation. Thank you all so much for listening. And unfortunately, due to unavailability, I've not been able to present this live. So if you do have any questions at all, please feel free to email me. I'm hoping Joe can share my email address in the comments section for you now. I will be available to respond to any emails you might want to send until May 5th, which is this Friday, as that is when I go on maternity leave. So I will not be available after that point. But please feel free to reach out if you did have any questions, comments, or if you wanted to find out a little bit more about this piece of work. I would be happy to answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. That was really interesting, and I'm sure could be a great help to many centres who are facing challenges as you found. I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
To when you first started implementing this, did you work with the thrombosis committee, or who did you have to work with to initiate it and then begin the trial? Who were the important on board, really?
Yeah, so this actually didn't need to go through the thrombosis committee. This was just a separate piece of work being undertaken by the pharmacy team as part of this dedicated ward pilot that we were doing and trying to set up. So it was as part of our key performance indicators, and a lot of the data kind of went through that stream of being submitted to the trust to show that we could make this change. And it was just a happy coincidence, really, that it really aligned quite well with what was happening with the thrombosis committee. I sit on the thrombosis committee here at the hospital that I work in, and being able to work quite collaboratively with them from this point in terms of taking on more audit, doing a lot of the point prevalence that they would have historically done. So dedicated ward pharmacists have now taken that on board so that we're helping that team as well. But in terms of setting up this audit, it was done solely from the dedicated ward pharmacists.
Okay, thank you. And in then implementing it, did you find that you potentially increased that awareness and, of the VTE risk assessment alongside colleagues, and maybe even initiated any training for colleagues around VTE?
Yes, absolutely. So especially for the pharmacy colleagues who haven't historically felt comfortable completing VTE risk assessments, there was a lot of training within that. But subsequently, I feel like it's filtered out. Although we've had no direct training with our junior doctors, for example, the fact that we are much hotter on picking up on VTE risk assessments and going to these doctors and saying, I've done the VTE risk assessment, this doesn't match, or this thromboprophylaxis is not appropriate for this patient, and having those conversations on the ward with them leads to them kind of upskilling slowly over time to appreciate, well, we've done the risk assessment and therefore we've picked up that this patient's had a bleed and therefore they shouldn't be on this. So it is very gradual training, but there's been no sort of overall big training plan. That still sits with the VTE nurse, lead nurse within the trust.
But I guess the embedding, and as you say, that communication really did get enhanced through this. Just obviously Thrombosis UK does an awful lot about patient information. While you had the opportunity to do this, did you find you were able to talk to patients more, provide any information for them around VTE?
No, so actually that wasn't one of the parameters that we looked at. Obviously, because this was incorporated into the pharmacist's general inpatient review, a lot of the time we do speak to the patients anyway. So if we're reviewing the rest of their medications, we might have a conversation with them. If they're already on an anticoagulant, we might be talking to them about that. But it's not something that we use to initiate handing out, for example, leaflets about VTE in hospital. That was kind of a separate issue, which I know that the VTE lead nurse in the trust is looking at, which kind of wasn't quite incorporated into the audit at this time.
And then really my last question is, given the benefit that this brought, did the pharmacist team find this was a sustainable piece of work that they could really continue with and feel very successful with as well?
I'm really glad you asked that. And yes, so we initially worried, is this going to take too much time away from our pharmacists who are trying to do plenty of other things? There's lots of other key performance indicators we've also been working towards. And actually, when you look at how long it takes to do a VTE risk assessment, when you're trained up to do it and you have all that patient information in front of you, you've got the notes, you've got the drug chart, because you're looking at that patient anyway, it's not taken a great deal of time. So the actual benefit that we've seen is huge, and the limiting factor in terms of how much time it takes is actually quite small. So in terms of sustainability, we are continuing to do VTE risk assessments, and it's not having a major negative impact on any of the other work that we're able to achieve within the day.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jessica. It's really interesting. And as you mentioned, I will put your email in the chat function now. And also anybody can go and view this again in the poster hall and leave comments or email you via that as well. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much.